The calmest person in the room is usually the one who has already survived the worst. At exactly 7:14 p.m., Emily Harper stood in the lobby of the downtown family court with one hand resting lightly on the strap of her tote bag and the other folded around a manila folder that had already been opened and closed 3 times. The air smelled like polished stone, recycled coffee, and rain carried in on expensive shoes. Overhead, the fluorescent lights gave everything a colorless honesty. No chandeliers here. No velvet curtains. Just a long row of metal chairs, a digital display ticking through case numbers, and a waiting area full of people pretending they were not listening to one another. Emily kept her face still. Not blank. Still, there was a difference. Her ex-husband, Grant, had once called that expression cold. Later, he had called it stubborn. Tonight, it was the only thing keeping her upright. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And if you believe dignity is the strongest revenge, hit like and subscribe. Now, back to her story. On the bench across from her, a woman in a camel coat whispered into her phone with dramatic disbelief, and Emily caught only fragments. She actually showed up? After everything. The words landed, familiar and stale, like old smoke. Grant had loved rooms like this only when he thought he could win in them. He liked pressure. He liked witnesses. He liked the shape of an audience around him. But Emily had learned something he never understood. The person who controls the room is not always the one speaking the loudest. Sometimes it is the one who breathes slowly, signs her name carefully, and does not flinch when her name is called. Her divorce papers were inside the folder, along with bank statements, a housing lease in her own name, and the final copy of a parenting schedule she had revised 4 times without asking anyone's permission. For years, she had let other people narrate her life. Supportive wife, difficult wife, too sensitive, not ambitious enough, too emotional, too much, too little. The labels had come at her like weather, steady and cold, until she forgot she had a voice underneath them. But the silence after a storm is not empty. It is full of things rebuilding. A notification lit up her phone. Grant's lawyer had requested one more meeting, one more friendly discussion, one more chance to make her doubt what she already knew. Emily looked at the screen, then turned it face down on the bench. Outside the tall courthouse windows, evening rain moved through the city in silver lines, soft as static. She could almost hear the old version of herself, the one who used to apologize before she finished a sentence. Not anymore. Her fingers tightened once around the folder, then relaxed. She was not here to win loudly. She was here to leave cleanly. And somewhere down the hall, where the voices were getting sharper and the doors were beginning to open, Grant was about to learn that the woman he underestimated had already started becoming someone he could no longer reach. The second meeting did not happen in the courtroom after all. It happened 3 minutes later in a narrow corridor lined with framed civic awards and the muted glow of wall sconces, where the sound of heels, murmured names, and paper shuffling softened into something almost intimate. Emily stood near a bench of dark wood, the manila folder still tucked under her arm, when Grant appeared at the far end of the hall with the same polished confidence he had worn for years like a tailored coat. He was speaking to someone over his shoulder, smiling that small, practiced smile that used to make other people lean in. When his gaze landed on her, the smile did not disappear. It sharpened, not because he was surprised, because he had expected her to look smaller than this. The woman he had once corrected in front of strangers, the woman he had once taught to lower her voice and call that maturity, was standing there with her back straight and her face unreadable. Grant's eyes moved once to the folder, then back to her face, as if measuring how much damage he could still do with a single sentence. But Emily did not step back. She did not ask permission to occupy the space between them. She simply watched him approach with the calm, almost distant expression of someone who had already stopped asking for fairness from a person who mistook control for love. Grant stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to catch the scent of his expensive cologne and the faint metallic trace of rain on his coat. He glanced at the folder again and gave a soft, dismissive laugh. "I did not think you would actually come," he said, as if her presence were a minor inconvenience he had not planned to accommodate. Emily let the silence breathe. Around them, a deputy clerk passed by with a stack of files, the paper edges whispering like dry leaves. Somewhere deeper in the building, a door closed with a dull, final sound. Emily's fingers rested lightly against the folder, not gripping, not trembling, just present. "You asked for the meeting," she said at last, her voice level and steady. No apology, no defense. The words landed with a quiet force that made Grant blink once, almost imperceptibly. He had expected hesitation, maybe anger, maybe the old habit of her trying to make peace first. Instead, he got stillness. He looked at her as though trying to find the crack where the old Emily still lived. But she had spent too many nights learning that peace built on self-erasure was only another form of surrender. Grant shifted his weight, and for a brief second the corridor seemed to hold its breath with him. His attorney had told him she would fold. His friends had told him she would come emotional, disorganized, easy to corner. Emily saw that calculation in the slight tightening at the edge of his mouth. She saw it and let him keep it. That was the new power in her life, not proving him wrong immediately, but refusing to perform pain for his comfort. She turned her phone face down on the bench beside her, a small gesture with the quiet certainty of a locked door. Then she lifted her chin a fraction, meeting his eyes with the same measured calm she had used in the lobby. No fear, no performance, just a woman who knew exactly what she had already survived and exactly what she would no longer carry for him. By the time Emily stepped into the cafe on Mercer Street, the afternoon light had already softened into a pale gold wash across the windows, turning every cup, every polished table edge, every quiet movement into something almost deliberate. It was the kind of place people came to when they wanted to look composed, and Emily had learned to value places like that. Not because they made life easier, but because they reminded her what it felt like to sit still without apologizing for it. She chose a seat near the back, where the sunlight reached her in a narrow strip across the table and where she could see the entrance without seeming to watch it. Her laptop sat open in front of her, not because she needed the screen, but because having it there gave her hands something familiar to rest beside. She had spent too many years being the woman who waited for someone else to decide whether her time mattered. She was not that woman anymore. Across the room, steam rose from a ceramic cup in a thin white thread, and somewhere behind the counter, a barista laughed softly at something a customer had said. Ordinary sounds. Gentle sounds. The kind that once would have felt impossible after everything she had endured. When the bell above the door chimed, she did not look up at once. She waited one breath, then another. Daniel Reed entered without announcing himself, without the restless, performative energy she had come to associate with men who needed every room to know they had arrived. He was dressed simply, in a dark coat with no visible logo, his expression calm in a way that seemed less like confidence than restraint. He paused near the counter, scanned the room, and when he saw her, he did not smile too quickly or stride over like he had already been granted access. He just nodded once, respectful and unhurried, as though meeting her was not a claim but a courtesy. Emily rose halfway from her chair, then settled again when he approached, because he did not expect more from her than she had chosen to give. "You picked a good table," he said, his voice low and even, carrying none of the practiced charm that usually came with first conversations. "It gets the best light." She almost smiled at that. Almost. Instead, she folded her hands lightly over the edge of the laptop and studied him with the same careful stillness she had brought to everything since the divorce began. Daniel did not rush to fill the silence. He looked at the open screen, then back to her face, as if he understood that questions could wait until trust had enough room to breathe. That alone startled her more than she wanted to admit. Most people looked at her like a problem to solve. Some looked at her like a story they were entitled to hear. He looked at her like a person who had already survived something difficult and did not need to prove it. Outside the cafe, traffic moved along the street in a steady hush, horns muted by distance, tires whispering against the dry pavement. Inside, the air smelled faintly of espresso and warm pastry, and for the first time in what felt like years, Emily noticed that her shoulders had dropped. Not all at once, just enough to matter. Daniel ordered a black coffee and a plain pastry, then returned with the same quiet precision that seemed to define everything about him. No unnecessary compliments, no probing questions, no attempt to rush the moment into something it was not. He sat across from her only after asking with a glance, and even then he kept a respectful distance, one hand resting loosely beside his cup. "I read your message," he said. "You were very clear about what you needed." Emily lowered her gaze to the faint ring of condensation beneath her glass of water. Clear. That word used to mean difficult, complicated, too much, but now it felt like survival. She lifted her eyes again, and this time she let her voice come out steady. I do not want to be managed. Daniel gave a small nod, as if that had been the easiest thing in the world to understand. Then I will not manage you, he said. I will listen. The words landed softly, but they stayed. Emily looked out through the window for a brief moment, watching a woman in a bright scarf cross the street with a paper bag tucked under her arm, watching the city continue as if no one's life had ever broken apart and reassembled in a different shape. Then she turned back to Daniel, and in that quiet exchange, something new began to take root. Not romance, not rescue, something steadier than both. A space where she could remain fully herself and still be met with respect. The kind of space Grant had never once offered, no matter how many times he had pretended otherwise. She touched the edge of her laptop, feeling the smooth metal under her fingertips, and realized she was not bracing for the next blow. She was no longer waiting for permission to exist. For the first time in a long time, the room belonged to her breath, her silence, and the life she was building one calm decision at a time. The first thing Emily noticed was how ordinary the morning looked after a life had been split open. Sunlight moved quietly across the kitchen counter, catching on the rim of a coffee mug, the edge of a folded receipt, the faint dust drifting in the air near the window. Nothing in the room announced that anything had changed. That was the strange part. The world did not pause when a marriage ended. The kettle still clicked off. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck rolled past. A neighbor laughed behind a closed door. And Emily stood still for one long moment, one hand resting on the back of a chair, learning how to breathe inside a silence that no longer belonged to him. She had once measured her days by Grant's moods, by the sound of his keys, by the angle of his voice when he walked through the door. She had learned to lower her own needs, to make herself smaller, to smooth every edge until there was almost nothing left of her except the version that kept peace. But peace had never loved her back. It had only asked her to disappear more politely. Now the apartment felt different. Not healed, not finished, but hers. Her laptop sat open on the table, clean and worn at the corners, the same old machine that had carried her through late nights, careful budgets, and the slow rebuilding of a life Grant had once called impractical. She touched the trackpad, then closed the screen with a quiet finality that felt like a vow. Today was not about winning an argument. It was not about proving who had been right. It was about refusing to carry his chaos another inch. That thought stayed with her as she dressed. A simple blouse, dark trousers, no jewelry except a thin watch that had belonged to her mother. She chose each piece with a calm she had not owned before, not because she felt fearless, but because she had stopped asking fear for permission. By the time she stepped outside, the air carried a clean edge of early autumn, crisp enough to sharpen the senses without biting. Cars moved along the street in measured lines. People crossed the sidewalk with coffee in hand and shoulders bent toward their own lives. Emily joined them without haste. One more woman walking forward in a city full of strangers, except she no longer felt like one. The office building on Mercer Street rose ahead in glass and stone, reflecting the pale sky back at itself. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polished marble and expensive paper, a scent she had once associated with places where important people decided the shape of other people's lives. Today, she did not shrink beneath it. She waited for the elevator with her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression calm enough that no one would have guessed how hard won it was. Then her phone vibrated once in her pocket. A message from Daniel Reed. I am in the conference room on the 4th floor if you would like to continue our discussion. No pressure. Her eyes lingered on the words for a second longer than necessary. No pressure. It was such a small phrase, and yet it felt almost radical. Grant had never spoken that way. Grant had always wrapped control in concern, criticism in confidence, demands in the language of care. Daniel didn't either. He simply made space. Emily slipped the phone back into her pocket and stepped into the elevator as the doors opened with a soft chime. The mirrored walls returned her own image to her, composed and unfamiliar in the best possible way. Not a woman waiting to be rescued. Not a woman rehearsing her defense. Just a woman arriving on her own terms. When the elevator reached the 4th floor, she walked toward the conference room with steady steps. the sound of her shoes muted against the carpet. Through the glass wall, she could already see Daniel at the table, not staring at his phone, not performing importance, not occupying space in the way men like Grant often did. He was reading a folder with quiet attention, one hand resting near a cup of coffee gone slightly cold. He looked up when she entered, and his expression changed only enough to acknowledge her presence with respect. "I am glad you came," he said. Emily set her bag beside the chair and lowered herself into it with the same measured grace she had practiced all morning. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Outside the window, the city kept moving. Inside, the silence felt different from the one she had lived through before. This one was not empty. It was generous. And in that calm, almost fragile space, Emily realized something she had not known how to name before. Her life was no longer a courtroom she had to survive. It was becoming a room she could finally inhabit. Before Daniel Reed ever spoke another word, Emily noticed the small things that made a room feel safe. He did not rise too quickly, did not reach too far, did not make her feel studied. He simply closed the folder in front of him and gave her the kind of silence that did not demand anything in return. The cafe on Mercer Street was quiet in that early hour. All pale oak tables, soft window light, and the low clink of cups behind the counter. Outside, the city moved with its usual impatience. Inside, time seemed to slow down around the edges. Emily wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and felt the warmth gather into her palms. It was a simple thing, but after years of living on alert, simple had become sacred. Daniel asked no invasive questions. He did not tilt his head with the practiced sympathy of people who wanted details for their own comfort. He asked only what mattered. "Did you get a chance to read the draft?" he said. Emily nodded once. "I did." Her voice was steady, almost unfamiliar to her own ears. He waited, patient enough to let her choose the rest. That patience, more than charm, was what unsettled her in the gentlest way. Men like Grant filled silence with pressure. They leaned, interrupted, corrected, and demanded. Daniel did none of that. He listened as if listening itself were a form of respect. Emily looked down at the folder resting beside her bag. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the cafe window, framed by the street beyond, and for one brief second she saw not a woman trying to survive a divorce, but a woman learning how to stand inside her own life without apology. She had spent so long making herself smaller in rooms like this, smoothing her voice, hiding her reactions, swallowing whatever might make other people uncomfortable. That version of her had become a habit, then a shield, then a prison. But today, the air felt different. Cleaner. Open. She could hear the soft hiss of the espresso machine, the murmur of a barista calling out an order, the faint rustle of pages turning at a nearby table. Nothing about the morning was dramatic. That was exactly why it felt like a turning point. Daniel finally spoke again, his tone calm and even. "Whatever you decide, I will respect it." Emily lifted her eyes to his, searching for the hidden angle she had learned to expect from men. She found none. No pressure, no performance, no hunger to be in control of the moment. Only steadiness, only room. The silence that followed was not the silence of waiting to be judged. It was the silence of being allowed to breathe. Emily exhaled slowly, and something inside her eased without ceremony, without announcement. For the first time in a very long time, she did not feel like she was being pulled back into an old story. She felt, instead, like she was being invited into a future that did not require her to shrink for anyone. Daniel's hand rested lightly beside the folder, not touching hers, not claiming anything, simply present. And Emily, still holding her coffee, realized that trust did not always arrive as thunder. Sometimes it came quietly, wearing a plain shirt, speaking in a low voice, and leaving enough space for a wounded woman to remain herself. That morning, in a cafe washed with sunlight and the smell of roasted beans, Emily understood that healing did not always look like triumph. Sometimes it looked like sitting across from someone who asked nothing of your scars, and finally feeling them loosen. The call came just after noon, while Emily was standing at the kitchen sink with her sleeves rolled to her elbows and a mug drying beside her in the rack. The apartment was quiet in the way a settled life could be quiet, not empty, not waiting, just still. When her phone lit up with an unfamiliar number, she almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. Then she saw the name in the message preview, and her fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. Daniel Reed. The short text was simple. If you are free this evening, there is something I would like to show you. No pressure. No explanation. Just a door left open without a hand forcing it. Emily stood there a moment, sunlight resting on the back of her wrist, and felt the old instinct rise first, the one that searched every invitation for a hidden trap. It had once been her habit to prepare for disappointment before it arrived. But this time, she read the message again and noticed what was absent. There was no demand in it. No cleverness. No need to be impressed. Only space. She looked out the window toward the narrow street below, where a bus hissed to the curb and a man in a navy coat crossed with his head down against the wind. Ordinary movement. Ordinary life. The kind of life she had once believed would never belong to her again. By late afternoon, Emily was in front of the mirror in her bedroom, lifting a dark green dress from its hanger and holding it against herself. The fabric caught the light in a soft, deep sheen, elegant without announcing itself. She did not choose it to make a statement. She chose it because it felt like hers. She smoothed a hand over the waist, then let it fall. Her reflection looked composed, almost serene, but the calm had been built, not given. Every steady breath, every clean line of the room, every folded sweater in the drawer had been a small act of return. When she slipped on the dress and fastened a simple pair of earrings, she did not feel transformed. She felt ready. The cafe Daniel had chosen sat on a corner that glowed warmly against the early evening cold, its windows lit from within, the front door opening and closing with soft, unhurried rhythm. Inside, the air carried the scent of roasted coffee beans and fresh bread, and the low murmur of conversation moved through the room like a quiet current. Daniel stood when he saw her, not too quickly, not with performance, just enough to show respect. He wore a charcoal coat and a calm expression that never tried to reach beyond what was welcome. "You came," he said. Emily gave a small smile, setting aside the old reflex to explain herself. "You made it easy to say yes." His gaze held hers for a brief second, then softened. Across from her, he placed a slim folder on the table, but did not open it yet. Instead, he asked about her day, about the neighborhood, about the little bookstore she had mentioned once without thinking it mattered. He listened the way good listeners do, not waiting to speak, not turning her words into a contest. Outside, the city lights had begun to sharpen against the dark, and inside the cafe the glass reflected her face back to her in fragments, a woman no longer defined by the damage she had survived. When Daniel finally slid the folder toward her, it was not heavy with pressure. It was a proposal for a community partnership, a chance for her consulting work to reach people who needed it. Real work. Honest work. A room of her own, in a new form. Emily rested her fingertips on the cover, then looked up. For one suspended moment, she understood that this was what rebuilding looked like from the inside. Not rescue, not spectacle, just the quiet dignity of being trusted with something valuable. And as Daniel waited without impatience, the lamp above them throwing a soft amber glow over the table, Emily felt the old fear lose its grip. She was not being asked to disappear. She was being invited to expand. By the time the evening invitation arrived, Emily had already learned not to flinch at the sight of her own name in unfamiliar hands. The envelope lay on her kitchen counter beside a bowl of lemons and a stack of neatly filed notes, its cream paper too elegant to be accidental. It was not a wedding invitation, not a court notice, not the kind of paper that once used to make her stomach tighten before she even opened it. This one carried embossed lettering and a quiet confidence, the kind that belonged to people who expected doors to open for them. Daniel read the return line once, then set it down with a thoughtful stillness that made the room feel even calmer. "You do not have to go," he said. His voice was low, even, without pressure. Emily looked at the invitation again, then at the city lights reflected in the dark window over the sink. Somewhere beyond that glass, her ex-husband would likely be seated beneath expensive lighting, waiting for the old version of her to appear. The version that would hesitate, apologize, lower her eyes, and make herself smaller for the comfort of others. But that woman no longer lived here. She had been replaced by quiet habits, steady mornings, and a life built from decisions no one else had approved. She picked up the envelope, turned it once in her hands, and let out a breath that did not shake. "I know," she said. That is why I might go. Daniel did not smile with triumph or concern. He only watched her with the same patient attention he always gave, as if he understood that courage did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it came dressed like composure. Sometimes it wore a simple black dress, stood in front of a mirror for one extra second, and refused to rehearse pain. Later, when Emily stepped out of her bedroom, the fabric falling cleanly at her knees and the soft light from the hallway settling over her shoulders, she looked less like someone preparing for battle and more like someone reclaiming her evening. The dress was unremarkable in the way that real confidence often is. No glitter, no plea for attention, just a sharp, elegant line, a silver clasp at the waist, and the kind of restraint that made people look twice. She adjusted one earring, then the other, and studied her reflection without looking away. There was no fear in her face now, only memory, and memory no longer controlled the room. When Daniel appeared beside her at the door, dressed in a dark coat and carrying himself with that same composed stillness, he did not offer a speech. He simply held out his hand. Emily paused for half a heartbeat, then placed her fingers in his. It was such a small gesture that no one in the world would have called it dramatic. And yet, for her, it was the whole point. Not rescue, not revenge, just a quiet decision to walk into a room where people expected her to shrink and let them learn she had outgrown the shape of their disappointment. The car waited outside in the cool evening air, the street washed in amber from the lamps above Mercer Street. And as they drove toward the event, Emily rested her hand lightly against the door, feeling the steady movement of the city carry her forward. She did not need to imagine the expressions that would greet her. Surprise, dismissal, calculation. She had seen them all before. What she had not seen before was how little they mattered now. This time, she was not arriving to be judged. She was arriving already whole. When Emily stepped into the venue, the room seemed to recognize her before it understood why. The chandeliers cast a soft, polished light over the marble floor, and every surface looked as though it had been touched by money and intention. Across the room, her ex-husband spotted her first. His smile arrived too quickly, the kind of smile built for an audience, not for honesty. He stood beside a woman dressed in pale silk, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as if she had been placed there for display. A few people nearby turned, already sensing the shape of a scene. Emily did not look at the woman for long. She looked at the way her ex straightened his jacket, the way his chin lifted, the way he prepared himself to perform the same old story in front of people who had once applauded him. He said her name with a warmth that sounded borrowed. Then came the familiar tone beneath it, that careful blend of pity and superiority he had always used when he wanted to make her feel small in public. Emily listened without moving. She had learned that people like him mistook silence for weakness. They never understood how much discipline it took to keep a face still when a room was waiting for you to crack. Beside her, Daniel Reed did not react. He simply stood with one hand relaxed at his side, the other holding a glass he had not yet touched. His expression remained calm, almost unreadable, but there was nothing distant in it. He was watching the room the way someone watches weather before it turns. Her ex continued, enjoying the attention now gathering around them, speaking as though he had the last word in every chapter of her life. Emily could feel the old pressure of those years brushing against her ribs, the instinct to explain, to defend, to prove. But it passed, not because she had forgotten, and not because it no longer hurt, but because she had finally understood that the urge to defend herself had once belonged to a woman who still thought his opinion was the center of the world. That woman had grown quieter, stronger, far less interested in being understood by people committed to misunderstanding her. The woman beside him laughed softly at something he said, and that laugh was meant to sharpen the humiliation. Emily gave her a brief, level look, then turned back to the room. There was no tremor in her hand, no rush of embarrassment, only the steady, almost unfamiliar sense that she was no longer standing in the ruins of someone else's verdict. Daniel leaned slightly closer and said, in a voice low enough for only her to hear, "You do not have to prove anything here." The words landed with more force than any speech could have. Emily glanced at him, and for a moment the noise of the room dimmed. Then her ex took a step forward, clearly preparing to push harder, to bait her into the familiar role he had assigned her years ago. But Daniel moved first, not dramatically, not with any need to claim the moment. He simply adjusted his stance and set his hand lightly at the small of Emily's back, an understated gesture of presence, not possession. The change in the room was immediate. A few heads turned. Conversation thinned. Her ex noticed it too, though he did not yet understand why. Emily felt the shift like a door closing gently behind her. She was no longer alone in the space he thought he owned. She was no longer the woman he could corner with a sentence and watch unravel. And as the silence widened around them, she realized something even steadier than relief. He had come here expecting to measure her by the damage he left behind. Instead, he was standing in front of a version of her he could no longer reach. The room did not erupt. It did not need to. The truth arrived the way winter light does, quietly and all at once, touching every face before anyone could pretend they had not felt it. Emily stood with her hands resting loosely at her sides, the silk of her dress catching the chandelier glow in a way that made her look composed without effort. Across from her, her ex-husband tried one last time to salvage the evening with a smile that had already gone brittle at the edges. He glanced from her to Daniel, then back again, as if looking harder might restore the version of the night he had expected. It did not. Daniel remained beside Emily with the same calm he had shown from the beginning, neither dominating the moment nor retreating from it. When the event host approached with a tablet in hand and a careful expression, the entire mood of the room shifted by degrees. A few people leaned in. A few others suddenly found their glasses very interesting. The host spoke with formal precision, announcing that the evening's major donor and new strategic partner was not the man standing near the front tables, but Emily herself, through a series of private investments that had quietly shaped the very project her ex had been boasting about for weeks. The words hung in the air with a weight no one could miss. Emily did not smile immediately. She only lowered her eyes for a brief second, as if to steady herself against the old instinct to shrink. Then she lifted her gaze, and there it was again, that same stillness that had carried her through every empty room after the divorce. Her ex-husband's face changed in small, readable pieces. First confusion, then disbelief, then the slow, humiliating understanding that the woman he had once treated as replaceable now held the power he had built his whole speech around. He opened his mouth, but nothing useful came out. Daniel turned slightly toward Emily, not to announce her, but to honor her. The gesture was simple. He let the room see what he already knew. Emily was not there because she had followed anyone. She was there because she had arrived at her own life on purpose. The applause, when it came, sounded hesitant at first, then fuller, then impossible to ignore. Yet Emily did not seem to hear it as victory. Her attention drifted past the startled faces, past the polished glasses and the expensive floral arrangements, to a line of city lights beyond the tall windows. Somewhere out there, her life had continued waiting for her to choose it. And now she had. Her ex took a step forward, but Daniel angled his body just enough to close the distance without drama. Not a confrontation, just a boundary. Emily saw it, felt it, and something soft and stubborn settled in her chest. She did not need to raise her voice. She did not need to explain herself. The room already understood what mattered. She had not come back to be desired. She had come back to be witnessed. And when the event ended and the last of the chatter dissolved into the night, Emily stood by the window with the city glowing below her and thought, with a calm so complete it almost felt holy, that the woman she used to be would have begged for this moment. The woman she had become simply allowed it.